Hi, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thank you for joining me today. As most of you know, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and my focus for this month is talking about healing from sexual abuse. Because it seems that while people, fortunately, are talking more about prevalence and prevention of sexual abuse, the reality of healing seems to be missing from the conversation. And so throughout the month of April, that's where my focus will be. However, today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about why healing is even necessary. So people often talk about how sexual abuse is so damaging, and it is. But in what ways is it damaging? How is it damaging? And that's what I'm going to talk about today, so that when we talk about healing, we'll have kind of a basis for what it is you're actually working on healing. People who don't have an experience of sexual abuse, so just kind of the general population, or sometimes even people who have been abused, but maybe have used denial as a way of coping with it, tend to think that if you've been sexually abused, it's going to affect your sexual intimacy, likely going to affect trust, it's going to affect your relationships, those kinds of things, but it's a very general idea. And the truth is that the damage that comes, that's created from being sexually abused, is because of the meaning that you attach to the abuse, not necessarily the acts themselves. Okay, if I've lost you, bear with me. I'm going to explain that a little bit more. So again, the damage, the long-term damage that is created from being sexually abused, whether it was once or hundreds of times, the damage that is created is because of what you tell yourself about the abuse, not the acts themselves. Now, if you are a person who has flashbacks or body memories where, particularly like if you're touched in a certain place or in a certain way, you find yourself reacting. Now, that's a little bit different. That does happen, but that's not necessarily something that everybody struggles with. But obviously that reaction is related specifically to the experience that you had. But the most significant damage that comes from sexual abuse has much more to do with how it affects your self-worth. And that's where the meaning that you attach to it becomes important. So, when you've been sexually abused, you try to make sense out of it. Even if you're not consciously aware that you're trying to make sense out of it, because you might have been 4 years old, you might have been 8 years old, you might have been 12 years old. If you're trying to make sense out of it, you can't do that. There's no way to make sense out of being violated in that way. It's just not possible. There is no sense to it. So what you do instead is attribute it in some way to yourself. So for example, many people, particularly when it happens kind of at a younger age or starts at a younger age, is believing that you're bad and that's why it happened. That you must be bad because that was a punishment and that's why it happened. But you ultimately tell yourself, even unconsciously or subconsciously, you tell yourself that somehow it's your fault. Maybe you didn't say no. Maybe you didn't tell right away. You take those pieces of information and internalize it in a way that reaffirms that it's somehow your fault. If it's somebody that you love and trust, you might say to yourself, for example, if it's a father, and it's not always a father, mothers abuse uncles and aunts and cousins and neighbors and coaches. It doesn't matter what the relationship is, people can be an abuser. But for this purpose, I'm going to suggest that it's a father. And if you are abused by your father, there's no way to make sense out of that, as I said, but especially when it's your own dad who's supposed to protect you and love you. And so you might internalize that dad thinks you're bad. How can dad love me if he's doing these things? And so you then end up with a message, the meaning that you take from that is that your dad doesn't love you. Well, if your dad doesn't love you, then you must not be lovable. And obviously this is not necessarily the same exact thought pattern that everybody is going to go through, but generally this is typically how it tends to happen. But even if it's a neighbor, so there's no expectation of love, you're still likely going to blame yourself in some way or feel that it's somehow your fault. And when you do that, it affects your sense of self, how you see yourself, and ultimately your self-worth. When you don't believe that you are worthy, it dictates how you think, therefore how you feel. It also dictates the choices and behaviors that you engage in. And there's other pieces of that too. So self-worth is often the biggest part of it. A lot of times there's shame involved. Self-esteem is certainly affected by sexual abuse. And so if you believe that you are unworthy or feel badly about yourself, you're likely not going to go after the things that you want in life. You may not even be able to recognize what you want in life. You may have shut down so much of yourself to protect yourself that you might be numb to life. Like if somebody asks you what you want for dessert, I don't know, I don't care, whatever. Do you find yourself sometimes thinking or saying that? Or if you could do anything in the world, what would you want to do? And you kind of think, I have no idea. I have no idea. Well, often that's because you have really shut down that part of yourself to self-protect. And so going after the things that you want in life is a big part of it. And that could be school or a career, relationships, friendships, trying something new. It really does permeate so many different areas of your life, and that's really why it's so impactful, because it's not just about having issues with sex or trust, it's about the belief of being unworthy or not having value that ends up dictating everything else. And then when you make decisions that aren't good for you, for example, being in unhealthy relationships is a really common thing that people struggle with. And when you find yourself in an unhealthy relationship, if let's say there's some controlling behavior on your partner's part, maybe some jealousy or insecurity, and what they might do is blame you for them being angry at you. And if you don't believe that you're worthy, you're going to believe that. There might be a part of you that thinks, no, it's not my fault. But at a core level, you're going to agree with that. You're going to think, well, maybe he's right. Maybe I shouldn't have done that. And so that reinforces that idea that there's something really wrong with you. It's that belief that creates the long-term damage. Maybe you begin to engage in self-destructive behaviors, maybe as a way of coping, maybe as a way to distract yourself, which is also coping, maybe even as a way to try to prove what you already believe about yourself. So for example, when most people, when they've been sexually abused, they use a few coping mechanisms pretty regularly and without even having to think about it. Minimizing, avoiding, denying, and rationalizing. And if you have used denial as a way of coping with the abuse. And it doesn't necessarily have to be denial that the abuse happened. It could be denial that you were affected by it, or that it was a big deal, or whatever it might be. But if you've used denial, the fact that you've been abused, the impact that that creates for you, those beliefs that it created are still there. And you might find yourself engaging in behaviors that are not good for you, whether that's an unhealthy relationship. It could be self-harming behaviors, specifically like cutting or hitting things to injure yourself. It could be using drugs or alcohol, or it could be even engaging in kind of risky behavior, whether that's promiscuity or potentially legal issues like shoplifting or vandalism. Those kinds of things are fairly common. So you engage in behaviors that are potentially illegal, but even if they're not illegal, end up creating consequences for you, even if it's just shame. When you do that, it reinforces that there's something really wrong with you. So as a result of the abuse, you developed a belief or beliefs about yourself and the abuse. You've likely also developed a belief about the world around you, kind of referred to as a worldview. So it's the expectations and ideas that you have about yourself and the world around you. And so, for example, the ideas that you might have about the world around you is people are untrustworthy, people are going to hurt you, bad things happen all the time. Those kinds of worldview ideas are something that are very common. Well, that comes from a result of being abused. But the damage, like if you believe that people are untrustworthy, the damage comes from not allowing yourself to get close enough to trust somebody. Therefore, you feel disconnected from people. That reinforces that you're unworthy. That's where the damage comes from. So it's not that sexual abuse isn't a big deal, because it is, because that's the catalyst that creates the beliefs, but it's the beliefs that lead to the long-term damage. So, unhealthy relationships is probably one of the biggest things. Not going after things that you deserve because you feel that you're undeserving, because you're unworthy. That's really the most significant way that people are affected by sexual abuse. Now, the good news about that is that you believe what you believe because it was the only way to make sense out of your experience at the time. As a child, you don't have the developmental capacity to really understand things. And as I said, there's no way to really make sense out of being abused anyway. But you literally do not have the ability to process and understand those types of experiences, or really much of anything, when you're really young. Once you recognize what you believe as a result of your abuse, you can change it. You learned it. It's not something that was inherent to you when you were born. You learned that from your experience, which means that you can unlearn it. I know it doesn't seem possible. I get it. I absolutely get it. But it is. It is possible. If somebody had told me when I was 8 or 15 or 21 that I felt the way that I did the things that I did because I had been sexually abused, and that I could one day feel happy, I could one day be in a healthy relationship, I would have rolled my eyes like every other young person and said, yeah, right, maybe for you, but not for me. That would never happen for me. You're different. I get it because I was there and I would have thought the exact same thing. And that's why this is so important. I was affected in all those ways. I was depressed, I was anxious, I was suicidal, I made really bad choices at times. I did things that I'm not necessarily proud of, but I'm not ashamed of anymore either. I was that person, and through understanding what I believed as a result of the abuse, I was able to learn something different. I'm the same person I've always been. The only difference is that I'm open to believing that maybe there's a different possibility than what I had always believed. And that's what I hope you take away from this video and from this entire month of sharing healing of stories. You know, no matter what your background is, it's really amazing how similarly people are affected when you've been sexually abused. No matter who the abuser was, no matter how many times it happened, even no matter how old you are or were at the time as a child, people are affected in very, very, very similar ways. The behaviors might be a little bit different, but how you feel, the things you think, those are very much the same across the board. So it can happen. It's not something that happens overnight. It's not even something that can happen in the year or two that you might be in therapy. It happens over a lifetime. But it does for everybody. No matter what your history is, everybody struggles with issues. Everybody struggles with self-doubt at times. It's not a matter of not struggling. It's a matter of knowing that your struggles don't define you and knowing that you'll be able to work through them. That's the difference. And I believe with everything that I am, that if you give yourself the opportunity and you have some support somewhere, that can happen for you. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I appreciate you taking the time to view it. Please feel free to comment. I would really love to have a conversation about healing and what that might look like and what your fears might be. Let's talk about this. Let's get this out there so people know that there is a possibility for healing. So again, thanks for joining me, and I will look forward to seeing you next time.